Welcome to this final chapter of the Spires Wi-Fi presentation. By way of review, we started with an introduction to give you an overall idea of the contents of the presentation. Then we went into an overview about the overall Internet and SpiresNet in particular. From there, the presentation transitioned to a semi-technical but not too technical presentation of how Wi-Fi works. And then the important topics was a survey. We did a survey of the building, the Wi-Fi signals throughout the common areas and in individual units to determine signal strength and characteristics of the Wi-Fi within our building. Following that, we developed an action plan which provided us guidance as to what we can do individually and as a group to improve the overall Wi-Fi experience throughout the building. The main conclusion of the action plan is channel assignments such that individual condos' Wi-Fi signals do not interfere with their neighbors' signals. Now we'll go specifically to those Wi-Fi channel assignments, which again is the primary result of this presentation. Each condo is assigned one channel in the 2.4 gigahertz space and a range of channels in the 5 gigahertz space. These channels are assigned so that we maximize the Wi-Fi speed but minimize interference from adjacent condominiums. Setting up the channels is a little bit like solving a Rubik's Cube, but in reverse. For a Rubik's Cube, the objective is to get the same colors on each side of the cube. In our case, the objective is to avoid colors that are the same next to each other. For example, on the right-hand side face, there are two orange colors. Imagine that that's one of the 5 gigahertz channels. We don't want those two channels to be adjacent to each other. Likewise, on the top side, imagine that those yellow ones are other 5 gigahertz channels, and we don't want those to be adjacent to each other. In terms of the actual geometry of the building, if we look at a side view of our building, what we want to do with the pairs of 5 gigahertz channels is to avoid them being the same. So here we see the side view with the 5 gigahertz channels, orange and yellow, overlaid on the building. Observe that the channels are such that there's no neighbor directly left, right, or above or below you that has the same channels as you do. Looking now at the plan view, we see a similar setup. In this case, again, the adjacent condos don't have the same channel assignments as you do. However, you will observe that the channel assignments across the hall are the same. Fortunately, the 5 gigahertz signal does not travel very far and doesn't penetrate from going outside your wall through the hallway and into the condo across the hall, so this is generally not a problem. In the case of the 2.4 gigahertz channels, imagine that we have channels red, green, and blue, and we want to set up a pattern such that none of these are adjacent to each other. For example, on the left-hand face, you see the green channels are adjacent side by side and up and down in part of the space. And we want to get a pattern that avoids that totally. So again, looking at the side view of the spires, if we do our channel assignments, they'll come out looking something like this. Again, channels 1, 6, and 11 corresponding to red, green, and blue. And you see that no channels are next to each other. The plan view, likewise, you see that no channels are next to each other. In the case of the 2.4 gigahertz here, we have 3 channels so that we can actually provide a slightly greater separation than for the case of the 5 gigahertz channels. This is important because the 2.4 gigahertz travels a farther distance. Next, we look at the actual channel assignments. Now, there's a lot of detail here, and what this really is a master plan for the entire Spires for every condo. On the left column, there's floors 1 through 40, and the top row, we have 2.4 gigahertz channels, condos 1 through 6, and then the 5 gigahertz channels, 1 through 6. As an example, imagine that we go to floor 8 and then find condo number 4. We'll see that the space there is intended to use channel 1 in 2.4 gigahertz, and in the 5 gigahertz, we see that it's in the channel range 36 through 48. So for any condo within the building, this table will determine which channels should be used to minimize interference. Now, how do you set these channels? That varies. It depends on your specific router. In some cases, there's a dedicated app available to do this. In most cases, there's a browser oriented view, so it's like an internet view, except that you're doing it locally. All of these generally do require an administrator password, which you should have for your system. In the case of the Apple Airport, there is a dedicated app, the Airport Utility, and it has a view that looks like this. From this, you select the edit option for your Wi-Fi router, in this case named Jupiter. Choose edit, and you get a display that looks something like this. And in particular, you'll see that it has a space to enter the 2.4 and 5 gigahertz channels. That should be done at this stage, and then you save it and you're done. The next case, we'll look at a typical Comcast router, and many of the other routers that are not provided by Comcast have similar characteristics, so only this one is being shown. You must log in with the default gateway name and password, and details are presented here. You should go to the Comcast internet site or the documentation site for your particular router to determine the exact details. Generally, you'll enter a username and password, and once you log in, you'll be presented with some options. And one of the options, as shown here, is to configure the 2.4 gigahertz channel. And in doing so, you'll have to switch from automatic channel selection to manual channel selection. It's important that you do that. Once you change to manual, then you'll be able to actually set the actual channels, again, to 1, 6, or 11, depending on your assignment. There's a similar capability to do this with the 5 gigahertz channels, but that detail is not being shown at this stage. Now, the next thing that we want to reinforce is that it's possible to improve your overall performance by adjusting the location of your Wi-Fi access point. The standard location was in the utility room mounted in the ceiling. We've determined that mounting these outside the utility room on the wall is one possibility that can improve the overall performance quite nicely. In this illustration here, the Wi-Fi access point would be mounted right over the door. There's enough space to do that, unless you've added some molding, in which case you might have to move it to a slightly different location. A final thing I want to mention is something called mesh Wi-Fi. This wasn't presented in the primary presentation, but it's something that we should be aware of. It's relatively new, and the idea of mesh Wi-Fi is to have multiple Wi-Fi access points located throughout your space. Now, this is really intended for large spaces, multi-level family homes, thousands of square feet and so forth. It really does not fit nicely within the Spires space, and we strongly discourage installing mesh Wi-Fi within the Spires. The mesh Wi-Fi's tend to interfere with multiple channels. They really are not very good neighbors in that regard. So we strongly disapprove of having mesh Wi-Fi within the Spires. And a final comment here, we mentioned alternatives. You can install Ethernet cable or get Ethernet over your coax cables, your cable TV cables. Also, you can send Ethernet over your electrical outlets through a power line adapter. So the final summary of the action plan is remove the unnecessary routers, those that you're no longer using, particularly if you're disabling your Comcast service. Please make sure that those are removed and turned off. And the next step is to use the assigned radio channels only. That is really the primary result of this presentation. Now, let me emphasize that for those people that have installed the standard Spires Net Wi-Fi, those radio channels are already assigned correctly. You don't have to do anything, unless, of course, you have other Wi-Fi access points, Comcast, for example, that you're still using. But as far as the standard Spires Net Wi-Fi, it's all been done as part of the master plan. We presented the indication that there are various sources of Wi-Fi interference that don't come from Wi-Fi devices, things like security cameras, portable telephones, and microwave ovens. So there are a whole number of possible electronic interference sources, and it's hard to detect exactly what's going on there, but you may have to be aware of this if you do have some significant interference. We can relocate the access point as indicated, or go to the various options for the wired internet. And that really concludes the presentation. We hope that you've enjoyed this and can understand now the reasoning behind some of our recommendations and things that you can do, that we can all do, to improve this very important aspect of our building here at the Spires. Thank you very much for your attention to the presentation.